1881. Sunrise Gulch in Dakota Territory. Annie Hartley counted the coins in the tin box under her bed for the third time that week. Her ticket east so close she could taste the freedom. When hoofbeats thundered up her drive, and a stranger pounded on her door with a marshal's posse 30 seconds behind him, the man's eyes met hers through the crack she opened. And something in that steel-gray gaze made her pull the door wider instead of slamming it shut.
I need 5 minutes to prove I'm not what they say.
His voice was level, despite the thunder of approaching horses.
After that, you can turn me in yourself, if you don't believe me.
Annie's hand tightened on the door. She'd been a widow for 3 years, running her late husband's ranch alone, saving every dollar for passage to Boston, where her sister waited with promises of society balls and respectable suitors. She had no business harboring a fugitive.
What are they saying you did?
Killed a land office clerk and stole claim records.
He pulled a badge from his coat, the Pinkerton shield catching the stormlight.
I'm James Lancaster. I was investigating claim fraud when someone put a bullet in that clerk and planted evidence in my saddlebag.
The posse's shouts grew closer. Annie made a choice that would unravel every plan she'd built.
Stables around back. There's a root cellar entrance under the hay pile.
She stepped aside, and he moved past her with a grateful nod that did strange things to her pulse. Marshal Wade Holloway arrived 2 minutes later with 6 men, all of them wearing expressions that said they expected to find a corpse. Annie met them on her porch with her chin up and her voice steady.
I saw a rider pass through heading north. Didn't stop.
Wade's eyes narrowed. He was a thick-built man with a badge that gleamed too bright and a smile that never reached his eyes. The marshal dismounted and climbed her steps without invitation, studying her face like he could read lies in the set of her mouth. Wade told her the fugitive was dangerous, that harboring him would cost her everything, that honest women didn't take chances on wanted men.
Then honest women like me report what they see. I saw a man ride north.
Wade's smile went cold, but he mounted up and led his men toward the ridge. Annie waited until they disappeared into the storm before returning to the stable. James climbed from the root cellar smelling of earth and old potatoes, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that made her look away.
You just made an enemy of the man who controls this county.
I made a choice. Don't make me regret it.
That night, with rain hammering her roof and James sleeping on her kitchen floor with his gun in reach, Annie lay awake, wondering what madness had seized her. She'd built 3 years of careful respectability on the ashes of a marriage she'd never wanted, saved every coin for escape, and now she'd thrown it away for a man accused of murder. But something about his steady voice and watchful eyes told her the accusations were lies, and Annie had learned to trust her instincts about men who lied. Her late husband had been a masterclass in pretty words and hidden cruelty. James Lancaster's honesty was written in every careful movement, every question he didn't push when she said she didn't want to talk about Boston, or why a ranch owner lived alone. Morning brought clear skies, and Markham Thorne to her door. He was the mail contractor, a man whose smile was warm as summer and whose eyes were cold as January ice. He wore fine clothes and carried himself like money was water, easy and endless. Markham expressed concern about the fugitive, offered to post men at her property for protection, suggested that a woman alone needed looking after in such troubled times.
I appreciate the concern, Mr. Thorne, but I've managed alone for 3 years.
His smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. Markham reminded her that her land claim was filed before the new survey, that complications might arise when the land office completed its review, that having friends in position to vouch for her validity would be wise.
Are you threatening me?
Markham's laugh was smooth as whiskey. He assured her he was offering friendship, that these were uncertain times, that the marshal had questions about land transfers. Then, he tipped his hat and left, and Annie felt ice in her stomach because she understood the game now. Someone was using the land office scandal to steal claims, and Markham Thorne's smile hit a man who played the victim while sharpening knives. James listened to her account of Markham's visit with expression that said he was fitting pieces into a puzzle.
He's the one. The clerk I was investigating had found irregularities in mail routes. Parcels with claim documents disappearing. Forged deeds showing up weeks later with new ownership.
But Markham owns half the buildings in town. Why would he need to steal claims?
Control. The railroad's coming through in 2 years. Land values will explode. He wants to own every parcel the rails will touch.
And the marshal?
Wade Holloway lost his ranch to foreclosure 5 years ago. Markham bought it for pennies. Now Wade wears a badge and does what he's told.
Annie felt the walls closing in. Her claim was valid, filed proper. But paper meant nothing when the men who handled paper were corrupt.
So what do we do?
We prove it. The clerk kept duplicate records in his personal ledger. If we can find it before Wade does, we have evidence.
And if Wade already has it?
Then, we find another way.
His eyes held hers with a steadiness that made her breath catch. James Lancaster didn't make promises he couldn't keep, but he also didn't run from fights he couldn't win. Annie recognized that quality because she'd worn it like armor for 3 years. The determination to survive when easier options beckoned.
The land office has a back entrance through the assayer's shed. I know the assayer's wife. She might let us in.
James studied her for a long moment.
This isn't your fight. You help me, and you lose. Everything. That ticket east, your reputation, maybe your life.
I lost my life 3 years ago when my husband's horse threw him into a ravine. What I've had since is existence. Maybe it's time I picked a fight worth fighting.
Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that made her pulse stutter.
Then we move. Tonight.
They spent the day planning, and Annie discovered that James Lancaster's mind was as sharp as his eyes. He mapped the town from memory, identified sight lines and escape routes, asked questions about who in Sunrise Gulch might be honest, and who wore Markham's gold in their pockets. By sunset, they had a plan that was half strategy and half prayer. Annie changed into dark clothes, pinned her hair tight, and felt like she was shedding the proper widow's skin she'd worn for respectability. James watched her with an expression that said he saw the wildfire she'd kept banked beneath propriety's ashes.
You ready for this?
I've been ready for 3 years. I just didn't know what I was waiting for.
They moved through town after midnight, keeping to shadows while storm clouds gathered again overhead. The assayer's wife, Martha, opened her door with frightened eyes, but let them through when Annie explained that honest claims were at stake. The shed connected to the land office through a storage room filled with survey equipment and dust. James picked the lock with quick, practiced movements while Annie kept watch. Inside, the office smelled of paper and ink. James lit a shielded lantern and began searching desk drawers while Annie checked file cabinets. They worked in tense silence, broken only by the rustle of paper and the distant rumble of thunder.
James.
She held up a ledger, its pages filled with neat handwriting. James crossed to her and read over her shoulder, his breath warm against her cheek. The ledger detailed every intercepted parcel, every forged deed, every claim that changed hands under suspicious circumstances. And on the final page, a list of upcoming targets. Annie's name was third from the top.
We need to go. Now.
Footsteps sounded in the street outside. James grabbed the ledger and pulled Annie toward the storage room. They'd almost reached the shed door when the front office lock rattled. Wade's voice carried through the walls, ordering his men to search every room. James and Annie slipped into the shed, and Martha shut the connecting door behind them with wide, terrified eyes. They exited into the alley and ran, keeping low while shouts erupted behind them. The storm broke overhead, rain hammering down in sheets that provided cover and made footing treacherous. They reached Annie's ranch an hour later, soaked and breathing hard. James secured the doors while Annie built up the fire. They stripped off wet outer layers with a practical efficiency that didn't quite mask the awareness crackling between them. Annie caught herself watching the way firelight played across his shoulders, the careful strength in his hands. James met her eyes and something unspoken passed between them. A recognition that they'd crossed a line from strangers to allies to something neither was ready to name.
They'll come at dawn. Wade knows we have the ledger now.
So we take it to the territorial judge in Deadwood.
That's 2 days' hard ride. They'll catch us before we make 20 miles.
Then we don't run. We make them come to us, and we finish this here.
James studied her with an expression caught between admiration and concern.
You understand what that means. We'll be fighting the Marshal and everyone he commands.
I understand that I'm tired of running from men who think power gives them the right to take what isn't theirs. My husband spent 5 years taking pieces of me until there wasn't much left. I won't let Wade or Markham do the same to my land.
The words hung between them, revealing more than Annie had intended. James's expression softened.
What happened to you wasn't right, and what's happening now isn't either. But you don't owe this town your life.
Maybe not. But I owe myself the chance to stand and fight, instead of always running.
Rain drummed on the roof while they planned their defense. Annie's ranch sat on a rise with clear sight lines in 3 directions. The barn and house formed a natural stronghold if they could hold until help arrived. James suggested sending word to the territorial marshal, but the nearest telegraph was in Deadwood, and anyone they sent would be intercepted. Their only chance was to make enough noise that honest men in town came running.
There's a church bell. If we can get someone to ring it before dawn, people will come.
Who in town would risk that?
Pastor Jennings. He's been preaching against corruption since spring. Everyone knows he means Markham and Wade, but he's careful enough they can't touch him without proof.
Can you get a message to him?
His daughter Hannah brings eggs every Thursday morning. She'll be here at dawn.
They settled in to wait, taking turns at watch while the storm raged. Annie dozed in her chair and woke to find James watching her with an expression that made her breath catch.
You should sleep proper. I'll wake you if anything moves.
I've slept proper for 3 years. Got me nowhere but lonely.
The words surprised them both. James set down his rifle and crossed to where she sat.
Lonely's a choice we make when the alternative looks worse.
And what does the alternative look like to you?
Like a woman who's strong enough to bet everything on a stranger's innocence. Like fighting beside someone instead of fighting alone.
Annie stood, bringing them close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his gray eyes.
You asking me to bet on something more than your innocence?
I'm saying that when this is over, If we're both still standing, I'd like the chance to know the woman behind the proper widow's mask.
That woman might not be what you expect.
I'm counting on it.
They stood like that, while rain hammered overhead, and something fragile and fierce bloomed between them. Then James stepped back with visible effort and returned to the window.
Dawn in 3 hours. We should be ready.
Annie checked her rifle and laid out ammunition. She'd learned to shoot the summer after her husband died, practicing until her hands stopped shaking and her aim held true. She'd never imagined using those skills to defend her home against a corrupt marshal. But life had a way of demanding the unexpected. Hannah arrived at first light, her wagon rattling up the drive with eggs and wide eyes when Annie explained what was needed. The girl promised to reach her father and drove off at a gallop that said she understood the stakes. Annie and James took positions in the house, rifles ready, watching the road. Wade came at full sunrise with a dozen men, spreading out to surround the ranch. Markham rode with them, sitting his fine horse like a general surveying a battlefield. The sight of him made Annie's blood cold because she understood now. This wasn't just about claims or money. This was about a man who smiled in public and destroyed lives in private, who played the victim while orchestrating theft. Wade's voice carried across the yard, ordering them to surrender the ledger and come out with hands visible.
You going to promise us a fair trial, Marshal?
Wade's laugh was ugly. He suggested that accidents happened to people who made trouble, that a fire could be tragic, that no jury would question a marshal's account.
Or we could discuss this with the territorial judge. We've got evidence of mail fraud, forged deeds, and murder. That ledger has your handwriting in it, Wade. You want to explain how a marshal ended up helping a mail contractor steal claims?
Silence stretched taut. Then, Markham's smooth voice cut through. He offered them a deal, suggested that mistakes could be forgiven, that Annie's claim could be validated immediately if she simply surrendered a wanted fugitive. His tone was reasonable, friendly even, the voice of a man offering help instead of threats.
I've heard your offers before, Mr. Thorne. You told my husband you'd help him with his debts. 2 weeks later, he was dead, and you owned his lumber contracts.
Something flickered across Markham's face. There, and gone. He expressed regret about her late husband's accident, noted that tragedy was common in rough country, suggested that dwelling on the past was unproductive.
The past has a way of catching up. That clerk you killed kept duplicate records. Every claim you stole, every deed you forged, it's all documented. And when that bell rings and people come running, you'll answer for it.
Markham's smile vanished. He ordered Wade to move, and suddenly the morning erupted into chaos. Men advanced from 3 sides while gunfire cracked from the windows. Annie fired at shapes moving through cover, her hand steady despite her racing heart. James moved between windows with practiced efficiency, his shots precise and measured. They held position while minutes stretched like hours, and the church bell began to toll across town, its bronze voice carrying the alarm. People came running, honest ranchers and shopkeepers who'd lived under Markham's control too long. They saw the marshal's men surrounding a ranch house, saw Markham directing the assault, and understood immediately what was happening. Pastor Jennings arrived with a dozen armed men and announced in a voice that carried like thunder that this ended now, that the territorial marshal was already riding from Deadwood, that every man present would answer for their actions. Wade tried to run and was dragged from his horse. Markham attempted his smile and victim routine, claiming he'd been misled by the marshal, that he was there to help restore order. But Annie stepped forward, with the ledger held high, and her voice carrying clear.
This book has every claim you stole, every deed you forged, every life you destroyed. My husband died because he owed you money and threatened to expose your fraud. You made it look like accident, but I've always known. Today, it ends.
The crowd went silent. Markham's mask cracked, and what showed beneath was ugly. A man who smiled in public while calculating cruelty in private. He lunged for Annie with sudden violence, and James moved faster, his rifle stock catching Markham across the temple and dropping him to the dirt. The fight went out of Wade's men after that. They surrendered their weapons while townspeople secured them. The territorial marshal arrived by afternoon, a grim-faced man who took custody of Wade, Markham, and the ledger. He questioned James for an hour, reviewed the evidence, and announced that all charges were dropped. James Lancaster was free, vindicated, and suddenly without purpose. Annie found him standing alone by her barn, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose.
You planning to leave?
Planning to ask if you still want that ticket east.
That was a different woman's dream. She wanted to run from a life that hurt. I'm not running anymore.
What changed?
I found a reason to fight, and a partner worth fighting beside.
James turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers.
Partners implies something ongoing.
Does that concern you?
Concerns me that you might wake up tomorrow and remember I'm a drifter with a badge and bad luck.
I'm a widowed ranch owner with a temper and trust issues. We'll figure it out together, or not at all.
He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his watchful face into something warmer.
Together sounds better than alone.
Then stay. Help me rebuild what Markham tried to take.
I'll stay, as long as you'll have me.
That night, the town held an impromptu gathering in the empty dance hall, celebrating justice and survival. Annie wore her burgundy dress, and for once didn't hide behind propriety's mask. James stayed close, his hand finding hers in the crowd. When everyone finally left, and they stood alone in the empty hall with lantern light casting amber shadows, James offered his hand palm up, not demanding, not assuming.
Dance with me. Not because it's proper or expected, because I want to hold you without a war happening around us.
Annie took his hand and stepped into his arms, letting him guide her across the worn floorboards in a slow waltz that was more about closeness than dancing.
You know everyone will talk. Widow taking up with the Pinkerton who brought scandal to town.
Let them talk. You've earned the right to live how you choose.
And how do I choose to live?
Tell me, and I'll do my best to make it real.
Annie looked up into his steel gray eyes and saw patience, steadiness, and something fierce that matched the wildfire in her own chest.
I choose to live without running. I choose to fight for what's mine and stand beside someone who fights with me. I choose you, James Lancaster, if you're willing to choose me back.
I chose you the moment you opened your door instead of slamming it. Everything after was just catching up.
He kissed her then, slow and thorough, a promise sealed in touch and breath. When they finally parted, Annie was breathless and steady all at once, grounded in a way she hadn't been since before her husband's death.
Stay. Build something with me that's ours, not inherited or stolen or compromised.
I'll stay. Long as you'll have me, I'll stay.
They swayed together in the empty hall, while lantern light painted shadows, and the storm finally cleared, leaving stars visible through the windows. Annie rested her head against James's shoulder and felt the wildfire in her chest settle into something warm and lasting. She'd come so close to running, to buying that ticket east, and leaving this rough country behind. Instead, she'd stood her ground, fought beside a man she'd barely known, and found something she hadn't dared to hope for. Partnership. Trust. Love earned through fire and choice, rather than expectation. James's arms tightened around her, and she felt his breath against her hair.
We should probably talk about practical things. Where I'll stay. How we explain this to town.
You'll stay at the ranch. We'll explain by living honest and letting our actions speak. People can accept or not, but they'll see we're choosing each other freely.
Your reputation, though.
Was built on being proper while dying inside. I'd rather be scandalous and alive.
He laughed, the sound low and warm.
Scandalous widow and falsely accused drifter. We'll be the talk of the territory.
Good. Let them talk. We've got a ranch to run and a future to build.
They danced until the lantern burned low, until the night grew deep and quiet. Finally, James walked her home through streets emptied of danger. Their hands linked and their steps matched. At her door, he kissed her again, gentle and thorough, a promise renewed.
Tomorrow, we start building.
Tomorrow, and every day after.
Annie watched him settle on her porch with his rifle across his knees, keeping watch one more night. But tomorrow, he'd move inside, not as protector, but as partner. Tomorrow they'd begin rebuilding what Markham had tried to destroy. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges, and the hard business of turning two separate lives into one shared journey. But tonight, standing in her doorway with the taste of his kiss still on her lips, Annie felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of escape, but the steady hope of building something real. She'd traded her ticket east for a partnership forged in danger and sealed in trust. She'd chosen to fight instead of run, to stand instead of hide. And she'd found a man who saw the wildfire beneath her proper exterior and wanted to tend it rather than extinguish it. The night was clear and full of stars. Annie went inside and left the door unlocked, a small gesture that said everything. James Lancaster was home now, not just a stranger she'd sheltered, but a partner she'd chosen. Tomorrow, they'd face whatever came together, building their future one honest day at a time. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. She sheltered a fugitive and lost everything but her heart. The morning after the dance hall, Annie woke with the sunrise, her body still remembering the warmth of James's arms around her as they'd waltzed alone in the lamplight. She dressed quickly, braiding her hair with steady fingers, and went out to find him already at work in the barn, mucking stalls with the easy rhythm of a man who knew honest labor.
Sleep well?
He asked without looking up, but she could hear the smile in his voice.
Better than I have in years.
She picked up a pitchfork and joined him, working side by side in comfortable silence until the sun was fully up and the horses were fed. They broke their fast with coffee and cornbread at the kitchen table, planning the day's work like partners who'd been doing it for years instead of just beginning. The land office scandal still hung over them, but James had a plan. He'd sent word to his old supervisor at Pinkerton, a man named Holleran, who'd always believed in his integrity, asking for help cutting through the corrupt layers Markham had built. In the meantime, they'd gather every scrap of proof they could find, every witness willing to speak, every forged deed that didn't match the original surveys. It would take time, But they had time now. They had each other. 3 days later, a telegram arrived at the general store. Annie was picking up flour when the clerk handed her the yellow slip, his eyes curious. She read it twice, her heart pounding, then walked back to the ranch at a pace just short of running. James was fixing a section of fence when she found him, and he straightened at the sight of her face.
Halloran's coming. He'll be here in a week with federal marshals and authority to review every land claim in the territory.
James dropped his hammer and crossed to her in 3 long strides, catching her up in an embrace that lifted her off her feet.
We've got him. Markham can't forge his way past federal review.
He set her down gently, his hands framing her face, his eyes blazing with triumph and something deeper.
You saved me, Annie. You gave me a reason to fight when I was ready to run.
You gave me a reason to stay when all I wanted was to leave.
She kissed him then, fierce and quick, tasting salt and sunshine and the promise of a future they'd build together. That night, they sat on the porch steps, watching the stars come out. His arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. The threat wasn't over yet, but it was ending, and they both knew it. Markham's empire of lies was crumbling, and when Halloran arrived with federal authority, the whole corrupt structure would collapse.
What will you do with your ranch when the dust settles?
James asked quietly.
Keep it. Work it. Make it profitable enough to support a family someday.
She felt his chest rise and fall with a deep breath.
A family.
If that's something you'd want.
It's everything I'd want. With you.
Annie turned to look up at him, seeing the future written in his steady gaze. Not the future she'd planned, fleeing east to start over somewhere safe and anonymous, but a better future, rooted in this hard Dakota soil, built on partnership and trust and love that had been tested in fire.
Then we'll build it together.
The week passed in hard work and careful preparation. They documented everything, organized papers, lined up witnesses from town who'd been cheated or threatened by Markham's schemes. Old Thomas came out to the ranch one evening, his weathered face serious, and told them he'd testify about the forged deed attempts and the threats made against honest folks. Others followed, one by one, until they had a case strong enough to bury Markham's reputation forever. On the 8th day, Halloran arrived with 3 federal marshals and a wagon load of surveying equipment. He was a tall man with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, and when he shook James's hand on the main street of Sunrise Gulch, his grip was firm and his voice carried. Halloran's voice rang clear. Your record was spotless until Markham started spreading lies. We're here to set it straight and clean out this nest of corruption. The investigation took 3 days of intensive work. Marshals going door to door, surveyors checking property lines, lawyers reviewing every deed and claim filed in the past 2 years. Markham tried to bluster and charm his way through, but his smiles couldn't stand up to federal scrutiny. When they searched his office, they found the stolen mail parcels hidden in a locked cabinet, along with blank deed forms and a ledger documenting bribes paid to the corrupt local marshal. On the 3rd evening, Halloran came to the ranch personally to deliver the news. Annie and James stood together on the porch, her hand tight in his, as the Pinkerton supervisor laid out the results. Halloran's report was thorough. Markham Thorne is under arrest for mail theft, forgery, bribery, and conspiracy to defraud. The local marshal has been removed and will face charges. Every land claim he tampered with is being reviewed and corrected. Your ranch title is clear, Miss Hartley, and your name is cleared completely, Lancaster. The agency wants you back if you're interested.
I appreciate that, sir, but I've found something better here.
James glanced at Annie, and Halloran followed his gaze, understanding dawning in his sharp eyes. Halloran nodded slowly. Then I wish you both the very best. You've earned it. After he left, Annie and James stood in the gathering dusk, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting.
It's really over.
It's really over. And we're really beginning.
James turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his.
Annie Hartley, I came here running from a lie, and you gave me shelter when no one else would. You believed in me when the whole world called me guilty. You stood beside me when it would have been easier and safer to turn me in. I love you for your courage, your fierce heart, your wildfire spirit. I want to spend the rest of my life earning the trust you gave me. Will you marry me?
Annie's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, her heart so full she thought it might burst.
Yes. Yes, James Lancaster. I will marry you. I'll stand beside you, work beside you, build a life beside you. I love you for your patience, your integrity, your steady strength. You saw past my proper exterior to the woman underneath, and you didn't ask me to be anything but myself. That's the greatest gift anyone's ever given me.
He kissed her then, deep and slow, sealing the promise they'd made to each other. When they finally pulled apart, the stars were out in full force, brilliant against the black Dakota sky. They went inside together, and James built up the fire while Annie made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, making plans for their future, talking late into the night about the ranch, about the life they'd build, about the family they'd raise. It was practical talk, grounded in the reality of hard work and careful stewardship. But it was threaded through with joy and love, and the deep contentment of two people who'd found their home in each other.
We should get married soon. No point waiting when we're both sure.
Next Sunday. We can have the ceremony here, just a few friends. Simple and honest.
Perfect. Everything about us has been simple and honest. Let's keep it that way.
And so they did. The following Sunday, in the front room of Annie's ranch house with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows, Annie Hartley and James Lancaster were married by the circuit preacher. Old Thomas stood as witness, along with a handful of townspeople who'd come to respect the couple's courage and integrity. Annie wore her best dress, the burgundy wool freshly pressed, with her mother's cameo at her throat. James wore his dark suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes never leaving her face. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to more than one weathered eye. Afterward, there was pie and coffee, laughter and congratulations, and then the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in their home. Annie stood at the window, watching the last wagon disappear down the road, feeling James come up behind her and wrap his arms around her waist.
Happy, Mrs. Lancaster?
Happier than I ever imagined I could be.
She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd changed her life by asking nothing more than shelter and trust.
I was saving for a ticket east, planning to run from everything hard and painful. And then, you showed up at my door, falsely accused and desperate, and somehow you gave me a reason to stay and fight instead.
You gave me a reason to believe the world still had good people in it. You risked everything for a stranger, and you never wavered, even when it would have cost you less to let me go.
They stood together in the fading light, holding each other close, knowing that the road ahead would have its challenges, but facing it together made all the difference. The ranch was theirs, the land was secure, their names were cleared, and their love was sealed. Everything else would follow, and it's the weeks that followed their wedding settled into a rhythm that felt both new and eternal. Annie and James worked side by side, from dawn until dusk, repairing fences, tending livestock, preparing the ranch for winter. The first frost had already touched the high country, and they knew they had precious little time before the hard weather set in. But the work was satisfying in a way Annie had never experienced before. Every nail driven, every board replaced, every fence post secured was an investment in their shared future. James proved to be as skilled with ranch work as he was with investigation. His patience and attention to detail serving him well in the endless tasks that kept a homestead running. He fixed the barn roof that had leaked for 2 seasons, rebuilt the corral gate that had sagged on its hinges, and reinforced the chicken coop against predators. Annie worked alongside him, her hands growing calloused but strong, her back aching but her spirits soaring. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, planning and dreaming. James talked about expanding the herd come spring, about building a proper smokehouse, about maybe getting a few more horses to breed and sell. Annie shared her ideas for a vegetable garden that would feed them year-round, for putting up preserves and curing meat, for making the ranch not just sustainable, but prosperous. They were building something real, something lasting, and every conversation brought them closer together. The town of Sunrise Gulch was also recovering from the scandal that had nearly torn it apart. With Markham Thorne in custody awaiting trial and the corrupt marshal removed from office, a new sense of order was taking hold. The temporary marshal appointed by the territorial governor was a fair man, honest and competent, and he worked diligently to restore trust in the law. The land office reopened with new oversight, and families whose claims had been threatened were finally able to secure their titles. Annie and James made several trips to town during those weeks, testifying before the territorial investigator, signing affidavits, helping to build the case against Thorne. It was exhausting and sometimes frustrating, rehashing the danger and fear they'd endured. But it was also necessary. Justice required patience and thoroughness, and they were determined to see it through. During one of those trips, they stopped at the general store to stock up on supplies for winter. The storekeeper, a gruff man named Henderson, who'd always been cordial but distant, greeted them with unexpected warmth. He shook James's hand and congratulated them on their marriage, then offered them a discount on flour and sugar as a wedding gift. Small gestures like that meant more than grand pronouncements. It told Annie that the town was beginning to accept them, to see them as a true part of the community, rather than outsiders caught up in scandal. Other townspeople nodded greetings on the street. Women smiled at Annie in passing. Men tipped their hats to James. It wasn't universal acceptance, not yet, but it was progress. On a cold afternoon in late October, Annie was in the barn mucking out stalls when she heard a horse approach. She set down her pitchfork and walked to the barn door, shading her eyes against the slanting sunlight. A lone rider was coming up the road, and as he drew closer, she recognized the uniform of a Pinkerton agent. Her heart skipped a beat. James was out mending fence in the north pasture, too far to hear if she called. She walked out to meet the rider, her mind racing through possibilities. The agent dismounted and removed his hat, revealing a weathered face and tired eyes. The agent introduced himself as Samuel Greaves, regional supervisor for the Pinkerton agency. He'd come all the way from Chicago, he explained, to speak with James Lancaster personally. Annie's wariness must have shown on her face, because Graves quickly raised a hand in a gesture of peace. The agent assured her he wasn't there to cause trouble. In fact, he'd come to offer James his job back. The agency had completed its internal investigation and determined that the accusations against James had been entirely fabricated by a criminal network trying to discredit him. His record was cleared, his reputation restored, and the agency wanted him to return to active duty. Annie felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She thanked Greaves politely and told him James was working in the pasture, offering to take him there. They walked together in silence, Annie's mind churning. James had found peace here, had built a life with her. But the Pinkertons had been his career, his calling. What if he wanted to go back? What if the ranch and the quiet life weren't enough for him? They found James replacing a rotted fence post, his coat slung over a nearby branch, his sleeves rolled up despite the chill. He looked up as they approached, his expression shifting from surprise to caution when he saw the Pinkerton uniform. Greaves repeated his message, laying out the agency's offer in clear terms. Full reinstatement, back pay for the time he'd been suspended, a promotion to senior investigator, and an assignment in Denver with excellent pay and opportunities for advancement. James listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When Greaves finished, there was a long silence. Annie held her breath, her heart pounding.
I appreciate you coming all this way, and I'm grateful the agency cleared my name. But I'm not coming back. My life is here now, with my wife, building something that's ours.
Greaves looked genuinely surprised. He tried to argue, pointing out the salary, the prestige, the importance of the work. James shook his head.
I spent years chasing criminals, living out of hotels, never putting down roots. It was good work, important work, but it's not the life I want anymore. I've got a ranch to run, a wife to partner with, and a future to build right here. That's worth more to me than any promotion.
The agent sighed and nodded, accepting defeat gracefully. He shook James's hand, wished them both well, and rode back toward town. Annie and James stood together in the pasture, watching him go.
You didn't even hesitate.
There was nothing to hesitate about. Everything I want is right here.
Annie felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of relief and joy. She'd been prepared to support whatever decision he made, even if it meant leaving the ranch. But knowing he'd chosen their life together without a moment's doubt filled her with profound gratitude. That evening, they sat on the porch wrapped in a heavy quilt, watching the stars come out one by one. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke.
Do you ever regret it? Giving up that life?
Not for a second. I traded a badge for a home, and I got the better end of that deal by far.
November brought the first real snow, a heavy fall that blanketed the ranch in white and tested their preparations. But the barn was tight, the livestock sheltered, and the woodpile James had built was more than sufficient. They spent those days working together indoors, Annie sewing and mending while James repaired tack and tools. In the evenings, James read aloud from the newspapers that came with the weekly mail, and Annie taught him her mother's recipes for bread and stew. They were cocooned in their own small world, and it was perfect. One night, as they lay together in the warmth of their bed listening to the wind howl outside, Annie spoke softly.
I never told you why I was so desperate to leave, why I was saving for that ticket east.
You don't have to tell me if you're not ready.
I want to. You deserve to know.
She told him about her husband, a good man who died young in a logging accident, leaving her alone with a failing ranch and debts she could barely manage. She'd tried for 2 years to keep it going, but the loneliness and the weight of it all had nearly broken her. The ticket east had been her escape plan, her way of starting over somewhere she wouldn't be the poor widow struggling to survive.
And then I showed up and complicated everything.
You showed up and gave me a reason to stay. You reminded me that this place was worth fighting for, that I was stronger than I thought, and that sometimes the best future isn't the one you plan, but the one you build with someone who sees you for who you really are.
James pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead.
I see you, Annie. I see your strength, your courage, your heart. And I'm grateful every single day that you opened your door to a stranger and gave him a chance.
They fell asleep, wrapped in each other's arms, warm and safe while the storm raged outside. By December, the ranch was thriving in ways Annie had never imagined possible. The cattle were healthy, the horses well-trained, and the income steady. James's reputation for fairness and skill had spread, and neighboring ranchers sought his advice on everything from fence repair to water rights. Annie's preserves and baked goods were in demand at the general store, providing a secondary income stream that gave them financial security. They worked as true partners, each bringing their strengths to the endeavor, each supporting the other's growth. On Christmas Eve, they hosted old Thomas and a few close friends for a simple supper. The house was warm with firelight and laughter, the table laden with roasted venison, fresh bread, and Annie's famous apple pie. After the meal, James surprised her with a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a delicate gold locket, engraved with their initials and the date of their wedding.
James, it's beautiful.
Open it.
Inside were 2 tiny photographs, one of each of them, carefully cut to fit the small frames. Annie's eyes filled with tears as she realized he must have gone into town and arranged it all without her knowing.
When did you do this?
I've been planning it for weeks. I wanted you to have something to remember this year by. The year everything changed for both of us.
She fastened the locket around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her heart.
I'll treasure it always.
As the evening wound down and their guests departed into the snowy night, Annie and James stood together at the door, waving goodbye. They closed the door and turned to face each other in the quiet warmth of their home. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in peaceful silence.
It's been quite a year.
The best year of my life.
Annie stepped into his arms, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She thought about the frightened, desperate woman she'd been just months ago, clutching her train ticket and counting the days until escape. She thought about the moment she'd opened her door to find a stranger in need, and the choice she'd made to trust him despite everything. That choice had changed everything. It had cost her the safety of anonymity, the comfort of her plans, and nearly her freedom. But it had given her something far more valuable. It had given her love, partnership, purpose, and a future she actually wanted to live.
Thank you for showing up at my door that night. Thank you for staying. Thank you for choosing this life with me.
Thank you for seeing past the accusations and the danger. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Thank you for being brave enough to fight for us.
They stood together in the firelight, holding each other close, knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them as they'd faced everything else. Together, with courage, with trust, and with the kind of love that transforms ordinary days into extraordinary lives. Annie Hartley Lancaster had traded her ticket east for a partnership forged in danger and sealed in devotion. And standing in the arms of her husband, in the home they'd built together, she knew she'd made the right choice. The only choice. The best choice of her life.